Opinionated is proudly supported by Stage and Studio Productions, Gateway Printing, William Jeffries Carpet Warehouse, and Perth Prop and Party Shop.
This is Jerry Georgiadis and welcome back to Opinionated. Each week we bring you some of the most pressing issues of our times. I've been opening up this program with a mantra: the ability to discover the truth is outstripped by the capacity to manifest deceit. Has it ever been more relevant than in today's topic? Today we're looking at propaganda, mass propaganda. Huge, but we'll make an attempt to delve into it. But before I move on, let me thank our supporters: Stage and Studio Productions, Gateway Printing, William Jeffries Carpet Warehouse, Osborne Park, and Perth Prop and Party Shop. Now that we've done that, dusted, our guests coming up in the first segment will be Colin Penter, in-studio guest, social scientist and social researcher, and a scholarly expert on neoliberalism. And Dr. Marcus Waters, crossing over from New Zealand, an accomplished academic, heavily published in visual media, communications and propaganda. But let us go now to an information package, a video package with our old mate Noam Chomsky and what he's got to say about propaganda and thought control, which he says is a much more pernicious form of propaganda.
Now, you make quite a lot in the book of the fact that there is freedom of expression in America. But what you do point to is something more insidious, because you suggest that there is actually, though there may be freedom of expression, there's a control of freedom of thought. Now, how does that happen?
It was understood back at the time of the First World War that it's becoming much more difficult to control people by force. The popular struggles have led to the development of unions, parliamentary labor party, franchise extended, and so on. And coercion is just not going to work by force. So therefore you have to control thought. It's very striking that the contemporary systems of thought control, which are highly developed, very self-conscious, so leaders talk all about it, they come from England and the United States. So the British Ministry of Information, which any reader of Orwell knows what it was, that's from the First World War. It was aimed primarily to convert a pacifist population into raving anti-German fanatics. And it worked. And it impressed people. It impressed the business world. That's the origins of the modern public relations industry. It impressed American intellectuals who developed the conception of what they called manufacture of consent, control of thought. Impressed Hitler, who blamed the German defeat on superior Anglo-American propaganda and vowed that next time Germany would be prepared. And it has led in England and the United States primarily, England secondarily, to huge industries devoted to control of thought and attitudes, because you cannot control people by force.
But dissent has been growing since the 1960s in the Western world, and people are far more sophisticated now. I mean, even popular culture reflects the fact that anything from the X-Files to the film The Insider, that the idea of people discussing things, of trying to manipulate public opinion, I mean, that's highly developed now.
Sure, but when people were under the lash, they knew about it too. People are so aware of it that it has led to tremendous cynicism.
Welcome back to Opinionated, and we'll turn to our guest Colin Penter, social scientist and social researcher. We've just heard Noam Chomsky, Colin, and he says that propaganda isn't just the selling of messages, but much more refined these days, intensified to thought control. Your views?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, that the first piece was on Chomsky, whose work was very influenced by a West Australian, actually, a man called Alex Carey, who was a West Australian, who was one of the the real doyens of the early work into propaganda, and Chomsky acknowledges Carey's work in his book. But what Chomsky and...
Manufacturing Consent, 1988.
Correct, yeah.
Yes.
So that's dedicated to Alex Carey, who was born in Geraldton. But what Chomsky and Carey both highlight, Jerry, is the fact that propaganda is in many ways more essential in a democratic society and more pernicious in a way, because I guess the point that Alex Carey makes and Chomsky makes as well is that power, be it corporate power, be it military power, be it economic power, be it social power, in a democracy there's always the risk that its power can be curtailed by democratic forces, by elections, by uprisings, by dissent. So propaganda in many ways is more prevalent. That's a point I think Chomsky makes. It's more prevalent in democratic societies than often authoritarian societies.
He actually pinpointed Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America, arguably imperialist powers. So is it much more intensified, refined, and then coupled and resourced by the military-industrial complex and various multinationals that nourish the shadowy element?
I think what the point Chomsky makes that's really critical to understand is that the military power, the military propaganda was really, I guess, one of the early stepping stones for the development of other forms of propaganda. And Alex Carey makes the point in his work that it was really military power, and then you had the development of PR industry, of marketing and advertising, which then made it possible for economic propaganda, for corporate propaganda, and for political propaganda.
Let's go to economic propaganda, but let's actually look at sovereign states. And you know, in these days we have supranational powers, and that could be arguably the United States and Great Britain, supranational powers that work extrajudicially, flouting international laws. But he talks about thought control. Then therefore is he saying that in totalitarian, so-called totalitarian regimes there's restriction of information, and in so-called democratic societies there's a flourish of information, an output of information to control our thinking?
Well, I think the point Chomsky made in that short piece was that in democratic societies there's less reliance on force as a means to control the population. So you have to find, the point he makes is how do we find, how does power, be it military, corporate, economic power, how does it find other ways?
But isn't that thought control? Isn't thought control on the scale he's talking about a brute force in itself?
Well, I guess thought control would, I mean, what Alex Carey points to is a whole range of ways that propaganda creates its impact. And certainly thought control is one, but in many ways the power of propaganda is that we don't know often, or we don't understand the hold that propaganda has over our thinking, our lives, our decisions.
Well, on that note, then the fight back, what do we do?
Well, I guess what Chomsky and Carey both make the point is that the first part of propaganda, the first way to challenge it is to be able to understand it and name it. And in a sense, we can then see what it is about propaganda that is having some shape or influence on us, and how we can change that.
Can you argue or demonstrate some examples of that type of propaganda?
Well, I guess if we think about some events currently, I mean, a good example would be the issues, the debates around asylum seekers in this country, where we've had a very powerful political propaganda process that tries to convince the population that there is a serious threat to our country as a result of, a few hundred
and then therefore, where does the media come into this?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, clearly you have a political agenda. The whole point of propaganda is you have a political agenda that's driven by power, by the interests of power, in this case by political power, and then clearly it tries to use whatever mechanisms. It might be the media, it might be public relations, it might be advertising, and of course the other way is appeals to fear. I mean, Chomsky makes the point about military propaganda appeals to fear, and that's what's happened with the asylum seeker debate, the use of fear as a form of propaganda.
Okay, thank you, Colin. We've just heard from Colin Penter, and we'll be back with Colin Penter in the last segment. We'll cross over to New Zealand to academic Marcus Waters, Dr. Marcus Waters, who happens to also be a very good friend of mine, and we've had many, many discussions on the issue that we're about to discuss. Marcus, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good, my brother. Yeah.
Marcus is a Gamilaroi man from Brisbane, and I'm good, Marcus. Marcus, you've just heard a little bit of Noam Chomsky. What's your views on some of what he said in Thought Control?
Yeah, look, it's been a long time since I've heard from Chomsky. I remember when I was an undergrad over 20 years ago, and he rose to fame, and it was the idea that sport and athletes were running things within the university. We've all seen the varsity football, the NFL in America, and the pride, and you know, this patriotism that comes from sport, this gladiatorial combat, the arena. And Chomsky realized that he had absolutely nothing in common with these athletes. So why was his whole life revolving around their success? So that was my introduction to Chomsky. I differ from your other guest and what Chomsky's saying. The reality is that, you know, let's not kid ourselves. Yes, media plays a role. Yes, there's all sorts of subdivision and media and moral panics, you know, designed to maintain control, fear within society, but it's enforced by force, you know, and that's the reality.
Marcus, what do you mean by force? It's enforced by force.
Well,
what do you mean by
force? The United States isn't convincing through intellectual debate and argument. We all know there were no weapons of mass destruction. Yes, they use moral panics through the media to justify, but they're justifying the actions of physical force. We, as the West, are invading countries, and we are invading third world countries. As a representative of Indigenous First Nation Australians, you only have to look at our rate of incarceration. Death in custody is still topical. The brutality of the police in dealing with Aboriginal youth, this is done by force. Then you've got Black Lives Matter in America.
Marcus, are you actually stating that propaganda is subsumed by physical force, by powers that have become so well resourced that it doesn't matter anymore, that propaganda may have been a mechanism at some point in time while these powers were accumulating resources, and that now it's just brute force and people are aware in effect?
No, what I'm saying is that they run in conjunction with each other. And the bottom line is that, you know, the police look after what many in the Indigenous or First Nation community, black, coloured people around the world refer to as a white privilege. There is a sense of safety and security within the West that comes from the very police, the very white police, who are killing African Americans. You know, let's not beat around the bush. There was a 12-year-old child who was shot dead within 2 seconds of police arrival. These are famous cases. I'm not saying anything that people don't know. We know this. There has been 100 people of colour killed, unarmed people of colour killed by white police over the last 5 years. This is why we had massive protests. This is why we have hashtag.
Let me ask you a final question, a little bit summarily. You talk about we know. Look, you and I both know that 1 in 19 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, First Nations people, will die by suicide, and probably as high as 1 in 12. And we know the incarceration rates. If we know this, why isn't white consciousness, why isn't the nation actually railing against? Is the propaganda, can you put that in reference to propaganda, or?
This is where I agree with Chomsky, and this is where I agree with your previous speaker. It's because they don't feel threatened, and this is white privilege. The use of force is also keeping a certain element within the community, i.e. white middle class, safe, because their possessions are looked after. If they're under threat, they call the police. The last thing we do under threat is call the police, because the police aren't going to remedy the situation in our community.
Marcus, on that note, we've got to have you back on the program. We've got to actually do a longer piece on this. Thank you for your time. And we've just heard from Dr. Marcus Waters from New Zealand. We've heard from Colin Penter. We've talked about a dominant society now. We're going to go to a commercial break and come back.
Opinionated is proudly supported by Stage and Studio Productions, Gateway Printing, William Jeffries Carpet Warehouse, and Perth Prop and Party Shop.